Well, thank you for joining us this evening. I've been looking forward to this event for some time. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating discussion. You know we're talking about philanthropy, how best to give. We are going to hear from four fascinating speakers. They're going to speak for around 15 minutes. They're going to talk about their own experience, their philosophy of change. They're going to talk about the organizations that they have set up or that they work with. After they've spoken, there'll be an opportunity for you to pose questions yourself. We'd like short questions rather than long statements because we don't have that much time, but I'm sure it'll be a very lively conversation that we'll have. I'll be listening out, I think, throughout the evening to three questions which I think about quite a lot, which is the first is how do we just encourage more philanthropy? It's still the case, for example, that well-off people give a smaller proportion of their income than disadvantaged people. It's an interesting question. How do we just get more of it to happen? Secondly, I'm really interested in engagement. We'll be hearing different models this evening of how to engage people, not just to get them to donate money, but to engage more broadly in thinking about issues, engaging with causes, offering other kinds of support. And then thirdly, which is really the focus for this evening's conversation, the question of impact. What is impact? And also, interestingly, does impact really matter? We are led to believe that people make their philanthropic decisions on the basis of impact, but is that really the case? Is there something more emotive taking place when people decide to give? So a fascinating set of questions. I'm going to tell you who the four speakers are. I'll tell you very briefly about them. You've got much fuller, I think, biogs in the papers that you got before tonight's event, and they'll come up and they'll speak in turn. So we'll first hear from Toby Ord, who's an Oxford philosopher, and he's inspired, it says 304 people. Maybe it's more than that already, Toby, but 304 people to give away 10% of their lifetime earnings to help the global poor. After Toby, we'll hear an old friend of mine, Lord Nat Way, as a social entrepreneur who set up a whole number of social enterprises, including Future Leaders, which aims to develop leaders of urban schools, and the National Citizen Service for teenagers. He, as you probably remember, is a former advisor on the big societies of the coalition government, and he's also the youngest member of the House of Lords. Then we're going to hear from Afshan Khan, who's the CEO of Women for Women International, which is an acclaimed NGO. It gives women in war-torn regions job skills and business training so they can earn a living, and teaches them about their rights so they can too learn how to become leaders. And then finally, we're going to hear from Paul von Soil, who's co-founder and CEO of Mayet, which is a New York-based clothes and accessories brand that sources artisanal skills from all over the world to create its design-driven pieces. And actually, Paul told me how to pronounce his name, and I've just done it wrong, so it's actually Paul van Sale. I got it right in the end. You told me 3 times, Paul, but I got it right in the end. Okay, so we're going to hear from them in turn, and can I ask you, therefore, to welcome our first speaker, Toby Ord.
Hi. So this question about how best to give is something that I've thought about a lot, and the organization that I founded and that I'm the president of, Giving What We Can, has been set up to really address. And this is something that we've spent literally thousands of hours trying to answer, and that's sadly still not enough time to answer it in its fullest detail, but it is enough time to make some inroads and to be able to share quite a bit of what we've found. I'm also a research fellow in philosophy at the University of Oxford. So I originally became interested in charity when I would have discussions as an undergraduate with my friends, and these discussions would go into the night as they do, and I was quite idealistic, and my friends would end up saying, well, if you think that, why don't you give all your money to help people starving in Africa, or some other cliche like that. And this was obviously designed just to stop my line of conversation, but it was something that I started to think about a bit more seriously as to, actually, why shouldn't I do that? Why, if people are created equal and people in Africa or Asia or anywhere else are just as valuable as me and my family, then maybe I should spend quite a bit of my money in order to try to help people and to help them as much as possible. So I started to think about what's the most I could achieve if I really wanted to help improve the lives of as many people as I could. And I started to think about that and to divide up the different possibilities, as I have here, into what I could do with my voluntary work, what I could do with my career, what I could do through my personal relationships, and what I could do through donation. And as I thought about it more and started doing some research, I realized that one can achieve a very large amount through donation, even in my case, of just on an academic salary. It's possible to achieve a great deal, and it's not clear actually that I can beat that with these other categories. So I want to focus on this. So I worked out that I would earn about £1.5 million over my life, and that if I really wanted to give away as much of that as possible, that I would be able to keep about £500,000 and still have the kind of quality of life that I had as a grad student. And this was actually pretty good. I have a wonderful wife, then my fiancée, and access to all of the best literature and poetry that the world has produced over thousands of years, as we all do. And the same with music and other things, and could walk around in beautiful places and talk to great friends and have conversations into the evening. All the things that really were important to me. And so there was this possibility that I could have all of that, but still actually be able to donate about £1 million. And so by putting it into those terms, it made me think more seriously about it. Instead of donating in dribs and drabs, once I saw it as this large amount, it really made it clear that it was worth putting in some time to work out how best to donate that. And as I say, there are many ways that one could use this to help people. I'm going to focus, in this case, on health and the health of people in poor countries in particular, as that's somewhere where I think it can be, there is the best evidence as to extremely effective charity. So a big question here, and this is really what I'm going to focus my talk on, is what metric or what way of measuring this? How should we think about the impact that one can have, and how can we compare different things? And there's something which is often talked about in this context, which is the percentage spent on overheads or administration. So they'll say that a particular organization spends only 10% of its money on administration and 90% on program costs, for example. I think that that's an interesting statistic, but ultimately it's not very valuable for making these choices. And there are multiple reasons for this. One of them is that the administration costs can actually be very important to running a charity very effectively. It could be that they should be spending more on administration than they are, and they should be better administered. But another reason is that what matters more than that is what they're actually spending that 90% or 80% or whatever on. What is it that they're actually doing? And here is, I think, the key question, which is, for a given donation, so suppose you're thinking of donating £10,000 or £100,000 to a particular organization, what will they do with that? What's going to come out of that? So what difference will there be, and how much benefit will people receive? And there is a lot of research on this, and a lot of academic research. I've talked extensively about this. I'm advising the World Health Organization on the ethics of global health, and it's something where a lot of that information, though, is in very academic language and so on, and needs to be kind of brought through to be explained as to how one can actually produce these benefits. I'll try to do a bit of that, although it might still be a bit academic, in which case I apologize in advance. So here's a simple example, though, to start off with. So it costs about $40,000 to provide a guide dog to someone. This is one way that we can try to combat blindness in a developed country. In contrast, it costs about $20 to completely cure someone of blindness caused by trachoma, and a similar amount actually for cataract blindness. So this is an interesting statistic because it means that for a given donation, let's say a $40,000 donation, that could either provide one guide dog to someone who's blind and help them get through their life, but they would still be blind, but they would have less disadvantage from that. Or you could completely cure 2,000 people of blindness. So this is an example of the kind of disparities you can get in terms of impact. It would seem to me to be better to be completely cured of blindness than to just have a guide dog, and then better to help thousands of people rather than just a single person. So there are often these very large disparities. But we can take this idea potentially further. In this case, I use blindness, but we want to compare more broadly, not just people suffering from exactly the same condition. I'm going to try to make it broad enough that it can cover everything to do with health. That's still not broad enough to make all the choices that you'd want to make, but hopefully I can illustrate some of these things. So one question you could ask is how many lives can you save. But this has a major problem with it, which in public health they say no one's ever saved a life. Because if you treat someone, say, for their heart attack, and you get them to live through it, then lo and behold, 20 years later, they die of something. So what we really care about is extending lives. And it really matters whether we extend them by 1 day, so we just, or whether we extend them by many years. So you could change it to a question about how many life years can we save, and that would be a much better question. But it still has this problem that there's still questions about the quality of that life. For example, in some cases, someone might be diagnosed with a form of cancer and have to choose whether to have a very intensive, invasive therapy, which would mean they'd have longer to live, but the quality would be lower. And so people make these trade-offs between the quality and the quantity of life. And there are also many cases where we have some kind of therapy which takes someone, it doesn't extend their life at all, but it improves it. For example, if the case of curing someone's blindness. So we want to be able to include those things too. And so the question that is normally asked in public health here in the UK and also in global health is how many life years adjusted for their quality can we save, or quality adjusted life years. And they often call these QALYs. So I'm going to talk about this concept a bit, but you can think of it as a year of healthy life is the rough and ready way to think about it. Let's see if we can get the next slide. Okay, so here's a rough schematic as to what's going on here. So the idea is this is a life, and we're thinking about the quality of this person's life over time. And it has its ups and downs. As their health gets worse, they get sick, and then they recover, and so on. Eventually they die, in this case at about 75. And the idea is we want to think about how many years of life do they have, and how high quality was it. And we want to think about the area under this graph is what's going on there. And so a simple kind of example is the two different ways you can improve someone's life in this case. The first is by improving the quality of their life during that period, and the second is by extending their life. And that you measure how these things compare by the area of these things. And they calibrate all of these things mathematically through a whole lot of survey questions and things, which I won't bore you with, but there are answers to all of this. And it's not really meant to be a precise measure, it's meant to be a rough and ready measure, but that will be enough to actually make some really interesting progress. And the real benefit of them is they allow us to compare apples and oranges, at least within health, to compare different types of ways of improving people's health. Now, one can ask, what is a QALY worth? What is one of these quality adjusted life years worth? The NHS uses this measure, and they say that they're prepared to fund a new drug if it costs less than £20,000 for each of these life years that it produces. Now, there are 8,760 hours in a year, so this comes to about £2.30 per hour. So I think that's a pretty good deal for an hour of healthy life. If you compare going to the cinema or something for an hour, I think it's better to have an entire additional hour of healthy life than to just upgrade an hour to a cinema hour. So I think that a year of healthy life is worth at least this much, and I think most people would agree with that. And they'd be prepared to spend more than that for their own health. However, can we get a QALY for less than that if we donate to different organizations? What I'm going to look at here very quickly is curing or preventing HIV. So here are a couple of different ways of approaching this. The first is a surgical treatment for an AIDS-defining illness called Kaposi sarcoma, and the second is antiretroviral therapy. And these bars just represent how many of these years of healthy life can we achieve for £1,000 of donation. And you can see there's a very large discrepancy there. Also, I've included a barrier here, which is how effective it needs to be in order to be funded by the NHS. And you can see that even the first one actually is effective enough to be funded by the NHS, but the second one is vastly more effective than it needs to be. But it doesn't stop here. We can zoom out quite a long way and then compare prevention of transmission during pregnancy. The idea is to give drugs to the mother so that the child won't have HIV. And that's a very targeted intervention, preventative, and is much more cost effective again. If we zoom out further, we can compare this with distribution of condoms to prevent HIV spread, is much more effective again because it's so cheap. And then if we zoom out even more, and then this isn't within HIV, but this is an example of something that one of the most effective organizations we know of does. is distributing bed nets to help prevent malaria, and that's much more effective again. And so, at least in the domain of charities working in global health, you get this kind of a distribution of effectiveness, where some things are vastly more effective than other things. And it's really worth bearing this in mind. In fact, here are a couple of facts about this. Health programs in developing countries can be a very good deal, and they can be 1,000 times more effective than spending marginal money on health is in the UK, because we've already got all of the easy wins here, but in many countries they don't yet. And 1,000 times more than is needed to be a good deal. So what I mean by this is they produce, for every £20,000, instead of producing just 1 year of life, they produce 1,000 years of healthy life. So they're 1,000 times more effective than those numbers we previously said were already a good deal. And also that our money's worth more than we might have thought, because in your wallets you'll each have more than enough to produce a year of healthy life to people living in poorer countries. But this is only if it's used on the best programs. It really matters which of those bars you're funding. And where to give it ends up being incredibly important. Now, normally these facts are just thought of by policymakers, but they're important for everyone when it comes to donating money. And so I like to think, at least in my case, when I donate money, I'm trying to help people, and I'm trying to help them as much as possible. If there were two different options and someone said one of them helped people more, I would definitely choose that one, and I would go to quite a lot of lengths to do so. And so if I wanted to donate money to help fight AIDS, it really matters to me where I'm giving that money, as to whether I would be donating to an organization that's treating Kaposi sarcoma or an organization that is funding condom distribution, for example, which was 100 times more effective. And also, in that case, I might wonder why I was restricting things to HIV and AIDS in the first place. Why, if I'm trying to help people, why only help people from one particular illness? If there's some way I can help 10 times as many people, or help the same number of people by 10 times as much by switching to malaria, I don't really care what disease is causing this trouble, so long as I can stop it. So that's another kind of thought that I think this provokes. Thank you. As I said here, the differences are not something of 10% or 50% of effectiveness, but up to 100,000% more effective, and getting 100,000% more return for your money if you choose really wisely here. And if you pick two at random from this list of interventions we studied with more than 100, on average, the more effective is 100 times more effective than the less effective of those two. And so this where you give can be even more important than if you give at all. And so I consider this for myself as to whether to spend £1.5 million on myself or to spend £500,000 on myself and donate £1 million. And I thought I would do the second of these. I would still have a great life, save at least 30,000 years of life, and I'm sure that you can do much more than this. But I've decided I wanted to go a bit further and not just think about what I was going to do, but to try to support other people in making a similar choice. So I set up an organization called Giving What We Can. And this is a community of people who feel strongly about poverty and really want to help people in need. And each member makes a pledge to donate at least 10% of their income until they retire to whichever organization they think can most effectively use it to help people in poverty. And they don't give the money through us, they just donate directly to wherever they think is effective. And they can ignore our advice if they want to. And we'd also advise them and advise others on where you can give most effectively and save people the thousands of hours of research time on this and instead just share our results and our reasoning. And there are two different aims we have. One of these aims is to get people to give more, and the other is to get people to give more effectively. And if you combine those together, then you can increase people's impact by more than a factor of 100 in a typical case. As we heard, we have more than 300 members at the moment and more than $100 million pledged. We just started about 3 years ago. And we have local chapters in many places. So to conclude, some charities help people thousands of times more than others. Where we give can actually be even more important than whether we give. The difference between that biggest bar and the smallest bar is a lot bigger than the difference between the smallest bar and nothing at all. And that using metrics such as this quality-adjusted life here can allow us to make comparisons between quite different things, which can allow us to see the magnitude of the differences which are there, even if that measure might be off by a little bit. You know, maybe we don't know exactly how bad it is to be blind, with some uncertainty about that. it's not going to be a factor of 1,000 that we're off by, but that's how big these differences can be. And so using these things, we can have hundreds of times more impact. So if you want to know more about our particular recommendations, then you can go to our website, givingwhatwecan.org, or you can email us, and also just talk to me after these talks in the reception. And I'm very happy to take you through a few examples and to give you some information about a particularly promising organization or giving opportunity that we've just recently found. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Toby. I have the privilege of being able to ask each speaker one quick question before they leave the stage. Toby, what about innovation? Where is there room in your model for people to try out new answers to intractable problems?
Well, that's a great question. And that's something where there is actually a fantastic use of this same metric, the quality adjusted life year, in something called the global burden of disease, which looks at how much illness or how much ill health is caused by many different diseases. Now, it's difficult to use that directly, but Bill Gates has been a big consumer of that information because he's looked at how much ill health is caused by malaria versus tuberculosis and other things, and he's using that in order to work out how good it would be if a malaria vaccine were developed. So that then he can say, well, if a malaria vaccine were developed, it would create a new kind of bar on that graph, which would be very effective, and we'd be able to use that intervention many, many times to help the many millions of people suffering from it. And so ultimately, you think of innovation as creating new interventions there. It's difficult to know how effective that will be because you need to find out the track record of people of creating new successful stories. But it's definitely something that is great. And if people do innovate, then those of us who are using this type of information can benefit from it and start funding that new thing.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, so it's very appropriate that we end on the point of innovation because our next speaker is indeed a social innovator in that way.
Great, thank you. Well, it's very good to be here with you today. And my talk, if I can get this clicker to work, is about this question. Where are the social reformers? I'm obsessed about social reform. Those of you who've known me a while will say that this is the burning passion, if you like, of my life. But I wasn't always so. In fact, it wasn't until I met this man that I became the obsessive that I have become. And what meeting him did to me effectively changed my life and is the reason ultimately why I'm here with you all. Today I'm going to try and share with you my take on what a social reformer is in the 21st century and why we need them and where we're going to find them and ultimately how we're going to nurture more of them. But first, let me tell you about how I met this man and what he did to me. I, as I said, didn't start off thinking I would become either involved in social enterprise or in politics or any of it. I was very simply minding my own business, working in a consulting firm, McKinsey, flying all over the world and helping to develop new ideas in mobile technology and the like. But several things happened to me. First of all, McKinsey were very kind and they gave me a very interesting offer. They said, you can go off to business school and come back, or you can stay and try and become a partner, or you can do anything you like and we'll still have you after a few years, either via business school or directly, which turned out to be very interesting and useful later on for reasons which will become clear as I speak further. But then another thing happened to me. I met a very interesting person called Brett Deutsche, who was a fellow colleague of mine in McKinsey. And he was leaving to set up a charity, which we now call Teach First, modeled on a model from America, Teach for America. And it looked very interesting, exciting. And because I had this very interesting offer, it's not anything initially to do with any sense of compassion or desire to serve the world, where I could do something completely risky and off the wall and still be able to, come back, a get out of jail free card. I thought, well, actually the logical thing to do is the riskiest thing. So I turned down opportunities to work in investing, venture capital, things which many of the people in this room, I'm sure, are engaged in, and decided to try my luck with Brett. and spent 3 years there, 3 exciting, fascinating years, really for me about applying what I'd learned from technology and business and how you scale impact in the business world, following in the footsteps as we did of people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, but applying it to this whole arena of social enterprise, social impact, which 10 years ago was still pretty new and fresh, and to some extent still is today. And we encountered a degree of luck, I guess, because within 3 years it had gone national, and had really been very much a high, rapidly scaling initiative, taking top graduates from the best universities and inviting them to go and work in some of our toughest schools, initially for 2 years, and then afterwards they would either stay on, and now there are head teachers and policymakers and leaders in education in Britain, or they would go on into other sectors, into banking, into the McKinseys, the civil service, but take that experience of poverty with them into the rest of their lives so they can be more of a reformer. I then left that and did go into venture capital. Didn't enjoy it so much, having had an experience like Teach First. But I did learn one thing from the experience of vetting lots of investment opportunities and only investing in a few, which is the issue in the world that to me doesn't seem to be one of a lack of money at the end of the day. I mean, individual causes need money, that's true. The issue seemed to be one of deal flow. We were seeing so many good opportunities, but never being able to quite feel that this was the one that we could give this money to. And the issue of who is going to actually take a step forward and be the entrepreneur and then create something that is worth investing in, that could make a difference, that was the real issue. Deal flow is the issue. So then I spent some time thinking, what am I going to do having been bitten by this socially entrepreneurial bug through Teach First? And where else can I learn about how others have done this? This notion that you take something and you scale it rapidly, just like a Facebook or a Twitter today. Not just something where you spend decades of your life building it up in one small environment, or working for a very large NGO, but something that can be developed from day one. We raised about $1 million for Teach First in its first year and then scaled it nationally very, very quickly and very, very deliberately. Well, my journeying took me all the way back to this man. This is the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. He was a Victorian reformer. And he was really one of many reformers in the in the Victorian era who had just experienced an industrial revolution, encountered huge amounts of social and other problems, environmental problems, and decided, really very much the elite, decided to apply all of their skills, knowledge and wealth to tackling these problems, often for the first time. And they were the ones that created chains of schools, temperance movements, abolished slavery. Shaftesbury himself was incredibly prolific. He not only helped to reduce factory hours for children, he helped to abolish chimney sweeping. He then helped to invent shoe shining, so the kids who weren't chimney sweeping suddenly had something to do. He helped to develop ships where they provide vocational training for teenagers to then send them to the New World with the skills of a carpenter or a plumber. Many, many different things, 60 different ventures in his life, many of which scaled nationally or internationally. And so really, I've spent the most of my last sort of 7, 8 years trying to follow in his footsteps, but combining that spirit, that Victorian reformer spirit, with the technology that we now have at our disposal in the 21st century, and also some of the skills that we have from business. Because actually, there is a difference between what they were doing, to some extent, in that era, and what we have to do now, certainly in developed countries. Many of the social problems we encounter are complex. Think about obesity, low aspirations in schools, global problems around immigration. These are not just about creating a school or building or providing drugs or changing the law. They require much more deep, complex interaction with problems that require a certain scale and a certain approach to systemic change, which is increasingly needed more than ever. We're finding actually that the legislative route and the money route isn't always the way to solve problems. So we need social reformers for the 21st century. Question is, where are we going to find them? And how are they going to be different from just purely more social entrepreneurs or more social financiers, impact investors, venture philanthropists, or indeed people who've pledged to donate, good as all those things are. We need social reformers to bring together what I call the elements that create the anatomy of a modern-day social venture. Basically, the ideal process, and this is something that we've learned through the years, developing charities like the Challenge Network, social enterprises that work in ex-offending, and many, many others that I've been involved with. Really to go from the idea to then think about what kind of people should drive forward this idea, and then think about the money, whether it's philanthropy or investment, that is needed to power this idea, and then finally to execute that idea, to come up with our solution. And many of the challenges today don't have solutions that right now are scalable to tackle them. And I fear sometimes, because of the abundance, certainly of money, and after the last 10 years, the abundance of people who want to be social entrepreneurs, that we don't always go about this kind of work the right way. The challenge we have, if we have too much money and an abundance of people who want to be social entrepreneurs, is we don't often necessarily focus on, well, what is going to solve the problem? What is going to solve obesity? What is going to address the issue of long-term chronic unemployment, intergenerational poverty, and so on and so forth? And so design is very important. And there's a whole ecosystem that now needs developing, just as there was a whole community of social reformers in the Victorian era, which I'm very passionate about developing. Social venture intermediaries, specific specialists in designing and coming up with those scalable ideas. Social talent intermediaries, finding people who've got the right skills, not just people who have a passion to change the world, but teams who have all the kind of technical and sectoral expertise and all the right governance to come up with ventures that work. And then think about the money, whether that money needs to be of an investment kind or a grant kind. We need social reformers who are adept at combining the ideas, the people, and the money to create what I call scalable deal flow. If we don't, there's a danger that we create inflation. There's so much money chasing so few scalable opportunities that suddenly we create a whole industry where people can frankly just live off the donations rather than actually get on with solving the problems that are out there. Now, in the Victorian age, there were three sources of social reformers. There were people who had life events that were life-threatening. They got sick. So think about Spedden Lewis, the son of John Lewis, who spent a year in hospital after an accident, which then led him to develop the John Lewis model. People who were first-generation wealthy tycoons, but who suddenly discovered that they wanted to have a greater purpose, and often it was, again, the second generation who took that forward. And then people of faith. Think about the Quakers. Think about many of the evangelicals who were there in the Victorian era. Sometimes all three coincided. And I think the hunt is on now, today, for social reformers for the 21st century, perhaps who've had similar experiences that have led them to come to this conclusion, who have the skill, the ability, and the insight to tackle complex social problems. Because 21st century reform, I posit, we've just been hearing about health, is about much more than just philanthropy, in my view, which is the business of impact, or about social entrepreneurship, which at its heart is a conversation about sustainability. To me, social reform is more like modern medicine, but in a different way. Society, increasingly Western society, with all of its complex problems, I find is like a human body with various conditions, various diseases, various viruses, increasingly, that affect it. And most of the solutions that we've come up with over the last few centuries don't work anymore. They're like antibiotics. We build schools, or we put more money, we spend billions on various programs, or we try to change laws. And somehow we find that we're getting diminishing returns. Because the nature of the problems, as I say, are different today. They're not just to do with a lack of resources or people not following the rules. They're to do with human behavior and attitudes, particularly to risk. And if you think about it, and I've thought about it, most of the initiatives that I've developed over the last few years have been about tackling risk. The only reason why I left business and got into what I was going into was somebody gave me a low-risk card to step out of one career and embark into the unknown. Teach first. How do you convince top graduates in the best schools to go to deprived schools? Or you find the very best brands that will guarantee them the same kind of opportunities to go into banking or other sectors because they were worried that teaching was just a one-way street. It's all about tackling risk, and I can talk more about this perhaps later when we get to the panel session. But ultimately, just as in health, we need to develop a whole infrastructure for social reformers. In health, we have teaching hospitals, we have consultants, we have randomized controlled studies. Whereas right now, sadly, in philanthropy, in a lot of work that we do, it still feels to me sometimes like we're going back 500 years. We're using leeches, we're using SROI, or we're using all kinds of methods, and we have a whole industry, but really we need to get more scientific. So that's why I'm developing with others a new center for social reform and innovation, designed to try and identify people from different walks of life who want to go down this journey, either staying within their bank. Imagine if many of our banks saw themselves as social reformers. In fact, the Quakers did. Many of our banks actually came from that source. And who are trained to think about the science of how we measure impact, how we develop scalable initiatives, and how we ultimately predict what things are going to work and what things aren't going to work with a huge amount of rigor. So many years ago, we experienced a world in which medicine was very basic. We cut off limbs, we tried all kinds of treatments. Today, we need something with more rigor, with more science, and practitioners, particularly with the right kind of ethics. And unless we raise up better trained social reformers for the 21st century, I believe that there is a danger that will produce a generation of, say, social bankers with unspent funds, or social entrepreneurs with ventures that cannot scale, and social measurement tools that make us feel good, but maybe don't measure the key drivers of change. But if we do find more of these social reformers, I believe the benefits to humanity will be immense. Thank you.
Nat. Do you think there's a tension between your account, which calls for system scale, innovation and change, and the way that charities tend to speak to single types of intervention? Freud talked about the narcissism of small differences, that charities are always trying to argue that their particular specific intervention is different rather than thinking in this systemic way.
Yeah, I think so. I think sadly, these days, a lot of behavior in our sector follows money. And money is often siloed and tied to very specific areas. Even in health, it's a classic example. You can compare your charity with other charities and so on. And I think when a field is mature, when a market, if you like, is mature, just as in financial services, you can do that. It becomes more commoditized, if you like. But many of the problems that we face are in completely new areas where you need interdisciplinary approaches that cross different sectors and boundaries. I mean, national service was a classic example. Everybody thought we were developing a youth program, but actually, which with personal development, and there's a whole set of players that do that. But actually, the really innovative thing about that initiative was we brought together in teams of 12 very rich kids with very, very poor kids from low-income backgrounds, from academies and inner-city schools with private schools. And they spent all this time together thinking they were doing youth development, which they were, but actually the real benefits of society is we were breaking down social barriers, cutting across, and they're friends for life. And that's what national service did when you fought in the war, officers and privates, and afterwards all the economic and social benefits that came of that. Now that kind of model is very hard to design in a world in which we all only follow this or that target.
Thank you very much. Hashan, over to you.
Hi, I'm here to speak to you about Women for Women International and a little bit about investing in women in particular. For me, great philanthropy is distinguished by what it accomplishes. How you choose to invest is actually up to many of you in the room to decide. Many of the philanthropists that have supported Women for Women International have done so because it gives them an opportunity to have an impact on the issues and causes they care about, really focusing on three things. What are your values and beliefs? What is success and how can it be achieved? And what do you want to be accountable for? Many of Women for Women International investors have a personal connection, whether it's the individual woman in Oxford who sponsors a woman in South Sudan so that she can engage in creating change in a woman's life, or it's a long-term investor like Jennifer Buffett, who clearly focuses her giving on women and girls, each of them choose their priority and how they want to make a difference in the world. And Women for Women International is actually evenly split between those grassroots individual donors, sometimes giving not more than $10 or £10, and some very large wealthy philanthropists like Bloomberg Novo Foundation. Our mission is to provide women survivors of war, civil strife, and other conflicts with the tools and resources to move from crisis and poverty to stability and self-sufficiency. But I guess the big question is, why invest in women? Given the choices and options, some of you may be asking, why invest in women and girls, particularly in conflict countries, when often survival is a basic challenge? And I think some of those indices that came out on health are clearly emphasis on choices that can be made. I want to share with you the sphere in which Women for Women operates and why we believe that investments in women and girls offer one of the greatest return on investment of any international development efforts. Nearly 4 million women and girls go missing each year in developing countries, so they're very real inequities with very real consequences for women and families. 2/5 are never born, and that's largely because of early-stage abortions. 1/6 of them die in early childhood, and 1/3 die in their reproductive years. Women make up 70% of the world's poor, but gender equality can boost productivity, raise living standards for the next generation, and make governments, institutions, and policies more inclusive and representative. Warren Buffett encouraged his son and daughter, when they started to emerge as philanthropists, to try to go where others are not. And Women for Women International's work is focused exactly on this idea. We target our efforts to serve marginalized and vulnerable women who typically do not benefit from traditional aid structures, or if they do, it's more often in the form of humanitarian assistance. The idea of investing in women is not new, but there's a real gap between the interest in investing in women and girls, what you hear in the media, and the actual resources that are invested, particularly in conflict-impacted countries. A recent research report found that while 90% of European foundations expressed interest in women and girls, the total grant monies actually allocated by foundations in support of women and girls was about 4.8%. If we invest in women and girls, it will not only go a long way to solving problems like poverty, accessing child health, which is equally as important as making sure those goods are distributed, because women take children to health centers. They don't get there on their own. And by and large, how people access goods and services is largely driven by community understanding. And it'll build a strong foundation for lasting peace in societies, because unfortunately, women are often left picking up the pieces after war. In terms of Women for Women's program, the next slide, we take a comprehensive approach to helping women address obstacles and become agents of change. Our one-year program focuses on 4 key areas: sustaining an income, health and wellness, family and community decision-making, and social networks and safety nets. In terms of sustaining an income, each woman receives about 52 hours of vocational skills training. That includes things like agriculture, livestock, trade, and services, but also business skills. We also encourage women to set up bank accounts and establish the habit of saving. 100% of women in Rwanda and Nigeria now have bank accounts, and that financial inclusion part is key for longer-term access to credit. So for us, we're really supporting women and establishing strong economic groups and cooperatives, and beginning to build women into the global supply chains, which I think Paul will speak about later, as a key way of investing in the future so that women become businesswomen and agents of their own change. But we've also learned that an integrated approach is crucial. You can't only look at one side of it. So health and wellness, we touch on all aspects of wellness, including family planning, hygiene practices, nutrition. And with this knowledge, women are able to better protect their health and their families' health and improve quality of life. Where they exist, because in many countries in conflict they don't, we connect women with professional health resources in their communities for additional care and consultation. And this has been crucial in two areas, dealing with women who have experienced sexual violence as a result of the conflict, and also in being able to access health care for HIV/AIDS. The next piece that is crucial is the family and community decision-making. Women for Women's year-long program emphasizes knowledge of rights, discusses the importance of civic participation, such as voting and participation in community activities, because we see women as agents of change for the longer term. And the program also provides women training in basic life skills, such as negotiation and conflict management. The next piece that we've seen as absolutely essential is family, community, and decision-making. The lifelong program talks about knowledge of rights, as well as social networks and safety nets. When a woman joins our program, she's placed in a class of approximately 25 women who become a support network, the foundation for future business ventures and collective action. For women who experience deep isolation that is often the result of war and conflict, forming these support networks are crucial to the success of overall well-being. We've invested a lot in how do we measure results, and that's largely when Bloomberg made their first 4-year investment in us. They pushed us on the metrics. So we really got strong on looking at helping women get engaged in transformative change, but also looked at tangibles. What are changes in assets and income? What are the ways in which women see themselves, the ability to change their situation and work towards their own goals? And we found that there's been nearly a 4-fold increase in income. Daily income averages are there in US dollars. The percentage of women saving a portion of their income also increased from 27% to 89%. And the percentage of women participating in social networks and safety nets increased from 36 to 77%. So the next big question is, so what happens after 1 year? In graduate follow-up surveys 1 year later and 2 years after the program, we found that the majority of these results hold. So the secondary impact, in 2012, Bloomberg Philanthropies and Novo Foundation commissioned KPMG to do an independent review of our programs in Rwanda and Congo. The study found broader community improvements across areas of increasing economic opportunities, improving health and wellness in children, improving attitudes of men towards women, and decreasing domestic and sexual violence. We had individual metrics for each of these areas, and these were crucial in securing the next phase of support from several of the philanthropists that have supported us. Our philosophy and approach to sustainable change is centered on the following. Stronger women build stronger nations. We serve women who are among the most vulnerable and marginalized in their society. Nearly half of the women we serve have not had any formal education, and only 38% have attended primary school. 55% are illiterate. Our theory of change is that with adequate resources to access knowledge and resources, these marginalized women can become agents of change in their family and community, driving economic growth and helping build more stable communities. We've been clear on the values, impact, and sustainability. And we see that there's crucial elements to making that a success. First is community buy-in. Before we begin working in a community, we work with local leaders to gain their support. Second, we are largely locally run. Nearly all of our staff and country offices are from those countries, and when possible, from the regions and communities we work in. A long-term commitment. We're committed to continuing to support women in countries until national organizations or national government systems are scalable enough to take over. And we emphasize a hand up rather than a handout. Our efforts are focused on providing women the knowledge, tools, and resources they need to change their own lives. Based on our own experience of more than 20 years, here are some considerations when determining how best to give. Be clear on where you want to have an impact. Ensure that there are measurable outcomes to help you gauge success. Remember that lasting change is slow and complex, and it will likely involve partnerships with many others. The systemic change that Lord Way spoke about. There's an African proverb that says, to go fast, go alone. To go further, go together. In order for philanthropic efforts to have lasting impact and be sustainable, they must be done in consultation. And then I think finally, go with the mindset of not solving a problem, but igniting change. Every effort to address the challenge should also serve as a catalyst for future action. I'm going to show briefly a video clip now of one of the aha moments that one of our investors had in why invest in women and girls. And then I'll take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about where we're going next.
It wasn't necessarily a person that said, this is the thing to focus on. It was in the patterns of the people that we talked to and through the conversations and things we saw. And we said, hey, what about women and girls here? And it was sort of like the little secret that nobody wanted to talk about. And everyone knew that life depended on that, 52% of the population. But it wasn't the thinking in the field. It wasn't being explicitly called out and said. And that was sort of our aha moment, that here is something that's based in truth that everybody knows, but it's not being called out. What if we highlight this? What if we focus on that? Then we can maybe see some real change happen. And it was just what we kept hearing from everybody and seeing when we were out in the world.
I highlighted this clip because Jennifer and Peter Buffett have invested enormously in women and girls. And it's not just been through Women for Women, with Nike Foundation and others. But I'm really seeing this crucial element of there's a lot of talk and not a whole lot of change in investment patterns. So there are challenges out there and ways of looking at how can we respond better. As Women for Women International, we've seen a couple of key points. One is partnership opportunities. In order to build on our success, Women for Women International is expanding partnerships to link jobs and sustainable business initiatives. And I know Paul will speak about this more, so I won't go into too much detail. Second is to strengthen our internal operations and infrastructure, some of the efficiency gains on effective administration. Third is working more with social enterprise, to link into private sector initiatives that are built on local businesses so that we're less reliant on export alone and we can help push local markets where people actually buy the products they're producing locally. The fourth is building sustainable product sourcing partnerships to provide long-term income generating opportunities for women. And the fifth is transitioning much more in terms of systems to using new technologies for data collection and metrics. And in that way, we've been able to be building on not just donations of financial resources, but what are systematic areas where the banking sector or the technology sector have innovation and design that we can incorporate into our own work. And then the fourth element, just so we know we don't forget them, because women are not only isolated, they are dependent on communities that include men. We're both expanding and better measuring and testing our men's leadership program so that the results we achieve are longer term at the community level with the buy-in of men for sustainable change. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Actually, can I ask, I was looking at some remarkable data last week, which demonstrated that in the top groups of employees in the world, the top 15%, I think United Nations calls it grade 1, women have made remarkable progress and are making remarkable progress, and perhaps the best progress in the fast developing world. But yet, in the other 85%, women are still suffering all sorts of systematic oppression. Do you think there's a danger that because women are doing so well at the top end, that we forget the nature of women's experiences in situations of poverty?
I think there is a tendency to focus on looking at who can be the leaders for change. And there's a general bias and obviously a longer term interest in political stability and economic growth in the short term may lead you to focus on the elites. But unless we're dealing with the grassroots, particularly women in conflict countries, I think we'll be unable to sustain the change we need to see. If I look at two countries, both India and maybe Pakistan, one of the few to have women leaders very early on, Pakistan has never been able to address any of its grassroots women in a systematic way, whether it's income, whether it's education, whether it's rights, whether it's mobility. And I think that has led to the kind of internal fragility in the state that you see today. So the investment in women and girls can produce some of the longer term changes I think many are seeking.
Thank you very much. And finally, last but not least, Paul.
It's always, is this working? Can you hear? It's always great to be the last speaker because you get to stave people off from nodding off. So I want to tell you a little bit about my life in some hope that it'll tell you a little bit about theories of change and theories of giving and theories of philanthropy. I'm South African. I cut my teeth in the anti-apartheid movement. I first organized amongst mothers whose children had been abducted and disappeared, then worked as the executive secretary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission alongside with Desmond Tutu for a very intense period of my life, and then founded an organization called the International Center for Transitional Justice, which did this work globally, tried to help countries deal with a painful past and steer a path towards accountability and reconciliation and justice. And I'm now the CEO of a luxury fashion brand, which makes sense. So I suppose I owe you an explanation of how I got from there to here. And in some ways, having established the International Center for Transitional Justice, having worked in 35 countries around the world, having raised $100 million in the process and having grown it to a staff of about 200 people at the high point, there were two crucial things that happened. One is we won the Skoll Award for social entrepreneurship, and I started hanging out in Oxford with social entrepreneurs. And two, I was chosen as a young global leader and started going to Davos, of all places. And in both of those places, I started to encounter people who were using the power of the market and the power of entrepreneurship to achieve social change. And as a human rights lawyer who came from South Africa, I was very accustomed and had grown quite adept at using the power of philanthropy to try and achieve social change. So at the high point at ICTJ, we were raising $20 million a year to support the organization. And here I found myself amongst a group of people who were trying to build businesses that could build and sell insecticide-treated bed nets as a way of avoiding malaria, people who were using microfinance in order to build wells in order to be able to give women potable water. And they were using the power of markets and entrepreneurship to try and achieve social change, not just relying on philanthropy. And I hasten to add, before I go any further, nothing that I'm going to say tonight should be taken as suggesting that there is a preferable model to change the world. NGOs and philanthropy play an absolutely pivotal and indispensable and irreplaceable role. For-profit businesses play a very important role, and social enterprises which seek to marry and merge those two worlds play a crucial role. I'm going to tell you about one model, but I don't suggest that it's preferable to any other that you've either heard tonight or may be interested in yourself. So having seen the power of markets and having come from a world in which we worked on human rights and accountability, I then almost by happenstance read a book by a man called Ashutosh Varshney who looked at ethnic conflict in India. And Ashutosh tried to answer a rather deceptively simple question. Why was it that certain cities in India, which had the same economics and the same demographics, had very variable levels of violence? Some had very high levels of violence and some had very low levels of violence. He does 60 years of field work. He had 60 years of data, 12 years of field work. He writes this book, and essentially his answer is associational life. And what does he mean by associational life? He says the cities in India which have the lowest levels of Muslim and Hindu conflict have the highest levels of Muslims and Hindus in parent-teacher associations, in cricket clubs, and in businesses working side by side. Now this is stunningly intuitive and rather obvious that if you spend every day interacting with people from what could be the opposite side of conflict, you're less likely to be roused to arms and encouraged to kill them by demagogues who are trying to do so for their own political purposes. And at that moment, a light went off in my head, and the light said something, to the extent that lights can say things. It went something as follows. If we could find small businesses in developing economies, and we could grow them and make them more productive, and we could allow them to become more profitable and to increase employment, and we could find businesses which had a particular character, we could also simultaneously build stability in communities that in my prior life I had witnessed as places of conflict. And so I try to think of a model which said, let's try and find three kinds of businesses. Businesses that bring people together from opposite sides of conflict, and house people under the same roof. Businesses that focus on employing and empowering women, because we all know if you give women the status and resources that come with the job, they have a peace influence on men. And businesses that work on poverty alleviation in instances where an absence of employment or of opportunity have caused people to take conflict-related tasks as their option, as opposed to the dignity and stability-oriented tasks that come with a stable job. And at that point, I really thought, well, what's the model to do this? How would you go about doing this? And we looked around the world and looked at all the different verticals that you could do it in, and came up with the idea of building a brand and a fashion brand, because the idea was if you could source goods from businesses that met these criteria and source goods in a way that gave people greater value for the work that they undertook and therefore gave them more profit and gave them greater opportunity to expand profitability and sell those in markets where there were greater resources, we would be able to achieve all the developmental goals that we hope for, but also some of the peace goals. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this model and hope it invites a conversation. So there are two ways in which this model works. There's a not-for-profit organization called NEST, and NEST is an organization which seeks to find artisans, assess their needs, and provide them with the assistance they need in order for them to be market ready. And on the other hand, there is a brand that buys from artisans who have been provided with training and support and infrastructure by NEST. And the concept is really quite simple, that you need a not-for-profit fund that's able to get artisans to a point where they can sell, and then you need a brand that produces value and that can sell in order for those people who have been trained to have a sustainable income. And the marrying of those two models is what makes the model sustainable and what produces value. So NEST says training and market access equals sustainability. It provides training, it helps retail partners get market access, and it focuses on producing sustainable businesses. So the methodology is to assess the needs of the artisan partners, to educate and develop the artisan partners, to connect them to a marketplace in order to produce sustainability. And the artisan partners that NEST selects must show strong leadership, they must be scalable, and they must be able of transforming their communities, and they must be working towards alleviating poverty, empowering women, or promoting peace. And NEST works on design and skill building, on providing facilities and safety, and providing people with business acumen and leadership development, providing people with technology and English literacy, and does so by delivering industry experts. It has a summer professional fellowship program which sends people from around the world to work with artisans in emerging economies, and employs in-country staff to be able to provide sustainable assistance to artisans. And it does both monitoring and evaluation. It both audits how artisans produce. It makes sure that they perform according to a code of ethics. And it does both business reporting and a social survey in order to assess that artisans' lives are indeed improving through these interventions. So 2 quick examples. Nest and Mayet, the brand that I'm about to talk about, found a group of carvers of horn and bone and hand pourers of brass jewelry in Kenya. And the artisans really produced stuff that was sold mainly in local markets and to some limited extent was exported. And both through Nest and Mayet, we worked very closely with the artisans in order to get them better carving skills, better equipment, better tools, better approaches to design, in order to take what was rather rudimentary objects and turn them into much more valuable and covetable objects. And in order to take a circumstance in which Anton, our key artisan partner, was working in a very rudimentary and extraordinarily unsafe workshop attached to his house, to build a full, complete workshop with tools, with polishing equipment, with a range of providing him with all the assistance that he needed in order to produce much, much more valuable jewelry. And the jewelry that he was able to produce by the end of this process was, depending on the particular piece, 7 to 20 times more valuable than the jewelry that he was producing to start with. Another project that we're working on that we're incredibly excited by is a project in Varanasi, India. As you may know, Varanasi is a city on the Ganges. It's the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. It is the home of hand weaving in India, a 500-year-old tradition. Some of the most valuable, covetable, beautiful weaving occurs, hand weaving occurs in Varanasi. And about 20 years ago, very savvy Chinese business people identified the value in this hand-woven silk, built a series of factories on the border, made the silks in cheaper products, copied the jacquards, and started selling them both globally but back into India. As a result, 90,000 hand weavers are unemployed in Varanasi, and an incredibly beautiful, covetable cultural resource risks becoming extinct. So what we have done is produce, together with the very famous and wonderful British architect, Ghanaian architect who now lives in Britain, David Adjaye, a silk facility that we hope to break ground on in the next couple of months, which will house weavers in Varanasi on the banks of a tributary and give both Muslim and Hindu villages an opportunity to work side by side, but also a way to produce in a much more beautiful and productive way. So I'm skipping through these images. Okay, so two quick examples of interventions through Nest of both carving in India and silk weaving in India. But in order for this to work, you need a brand. People need to buy the goods, and you need to produce a covetable and desirable brand. So Mayet is a luxury brand. It says it's pioneering a new luxury by celebrating the rare and unexpected. It's rare skills from unexpected people, unexpected places. It's built an entire media strategy to have the brand distributed. It shows its collections on the Paris runway, whether it's block printing from Jaipur, whether it's hand-woven silks from Varanasi, whether it's embroidered goods from Ahmedabad, India, where Muslim and Hindu women work together to produce embroidery, whether it's hand batiks from Indonesia, again, hand embroidery from Ahmedabad. And it's developed a bit of a celebrity following, from Kate Hudson to Charlize Theron to Alicia Keys to Kate Moss. And now I'm going to show you a few videos which give you a sense of the world of Mayet plus Nest. So the first video is a video of Daria Weboe, who's one of the world's most recognized supermodels, wearing products produced in India, in Jaipur and in Varanasi. The next video shows batik being applied in Indonesia. These batiks are taken from stained glass windows in Peruvian cathedrals, which is part of Mayet's Spring Summer 12 collection. Video shows fine jewelry being produced in Jaipur, which is one of the most legendary places for the production of jewelry. And the final video, which we'll end with, is a video which shows hand weaving of silk in Varanasi. And these hand weavers will be housed in the David Adjaye facility that I referred to earlier. And with that, I end. Thank you.
Now, Paul, I'd love to ask you a question, but we're running out of time. So what we'll do is bring all the speakers onto the stage, and then we'll open up to the floor. Thank you very much for being the first volunteer.
Hi, it's Rosie Tao. I work for Deutsche Bank in corporate citizenship, and it's a question for Toby, really. I wondered, given the areas that you've been looking at, have you got a take on the social return on investment measure that's been quite popular lately?
Are we taking them in groups?
Well, why don't you just take that one? Yeah, defend social return on investment, because Nat wasn't being very polite about it.
Well, I'm not an expert on the particulars of social return on investment as the particular metric, but there is obviously this big challenge if you're looking at things across different areas to try to work out how to do the comparisons. There are a lot of different approaches. Another one is cost-benefit analysis of the impacts and so on. I think there are a lot of problems with such models, but I don't want to get into all the details on them at the moment.
Okay. Paul, I'm going to just...
Happy to talk afterwards.
Paul, I'm just going to pose to you the question I was going to ask at the end of your talk while I scour the room for other hands, which is, thank you, which is when one's out buying clothes, there are a kind of array of different claims being made for the provenance of those. Does it matter that there are so many different schemes and labels and brands? Is it a good thing, or do you think it would be better if consumers had a kind of easier way of being able to judge?
Judge what?
Judge which clothes are the most right-on clothes to buy.
And by right-on, you mean?
Well, I don't know.
Okay. No, I asked that because I think it's actually an interesting way of formulating the question, because I think there are two ways of thinking about products or companies with a strong social mission. And one is, my strong view is that if you're going to have a company, a for-profit company with a social mission, it has to win in its category on its own terms. So if you're producing ice cream and you're doing it from sustainable farms in Vermont and it tastes disgusting, then you shouldn't be doing it. And if you're going to be doing fruit and nut bars, they have to be the best. And if it's going to be clothing, it's got to stand up and be as good as Chanel and Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent and everybody else. And then, if it has a social mission, the social mission has got to be carefully articulated and you've got to be able to measure and defend the impact. And if you're going to try and harness the power of the market, then you've got to win in the market. And then when you have the social impact which emerges from winning, you have to be able to have a coherent and defensible thesis that isn't about greenwashing or trying to market something that isn't really what it is. So you have to be able to say, if you buy this product, here are the tangible social outcomes that will emerge, and you have to be able to defend those with tremendous transparency and integrity. And then the market works. People will buy your clothes whether they like them or not, and they'll buy them either because they look sexy or because they want to promote peace between Muslims and Hindus, and hopefully both. And those two things work in concert.
Thank you. There was a question at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Malani Mehra, and I'm in very good company tonight because I'm a YGL and I'm a member of the RSA. So I just wanted to thank you, first of all. I'm hugely admiring of your personal efforts. I would like to, however, start with a big question and a challenging one to you. I'm Indian, and I founded an Indian organization about 12 years ago. So I work in the cesspit of the NGO world and political world in India. Now, what I found missing from all of your interventions, your presentations this evening, was a subject that we deal with on a daily level in countries where governance systems don't work, and that is the fundamental role of institutions, because we rely on institutions to scale up. None of you mentioned the role of the state. Now, philanthropy is well and good, but you only scale up at a level that counts in a country of 1.2 billion people if you engage the governing classes. Just a quick example for all of the panelists. So, Paul, you talked about public health. The biggest thing that the Indian government did was to add fluoride to water and iodine to salt and micronutrients to bread. Nat, the best thing that was done in this country in terms of education, social innovation, was the comprehensive system of schooling, which after national service ensured that all classes came together. They had to. Afshan, women, microfinance. In India, we've had the State Bank of India for 60 years, and it provides the largest number of loans and access to financial literacy and empowerment for women. And finally, Paul, Banaras, it's a city that I lived in as a child. I know it very well. If you actually want to improve and this is something that no one mentioned, the role of workers and who agitates for workers, who's agitated for workers for more than 100 years, is trade unions. In India, we won rights for domestic workers and industrial workers because of precisely that. In Brazil, domestic female workers have just 1 month ago got rights that no NGO or philanthropy organization got. So, big question, where is the role of the state in all of your interventions?
Okay, I'll let you stay on with that because you're an RSA fellow and you were on a roll, but it was quite a long question. But I will bring the panel in. But there's someone else just along there who wants to ask a question. Yes, that's right.
Actually, this follows on Jamie Drummond, co-founder of a group called One. I'm a former YGL, and we do advocacy, which I think is the follow-on to your point. But I thought it was worth adding this. The issue is, what can the state do? The issue is, what can philanthropists do to influence the state? That is advocacy. And what are effective, scalable advocacy models? I know of a few. Be interesting to know your thoughts. The anti-apartheid campaign was pretty good advocacy, for example. Be good to hear a bit more about that.
Okay, and then there's a hand here. There's a person here, in fact, attached to the hand, fortunately.
Hi, I'm Margaret McCabe, the founder of and CEO of DebateMate. We're a social enterprise. We teach debating in poor communities around the world. Basically, my question is this. MIT has a faculty that studies effective ways of how to reduce poverty, particularly child poverty. They've produced a book called Poor Economics. And in essence, what it says, and they'll excuse me if I'm being too brief, but basically they say that charity and aid doesn't work, that social enterprise works, so it has to be market-driven to deliver true social change. And I'd just like to know your comments on that.
Okay, panel, if you can respond, which will be difficult because these are tough questions to these very briefly, I can get another round of questions going. So, Nat, why don't you start on the state?
Well, this debate could last for years, couldn't it? What's the role
Not
of the
tonight,
state? I know, not tonight. I take a slightly different view. I think the state, over the last century or so, has gotten quite large all around the world, and therefore advocacy is important because it has been the only game in town. But what I'm passionate about is, if you think about social reform in previous eras, not just in Britain, but particularly this was the experience here, many of the innovations that the state then took and finished the job on included the schools, included the healthcare systems that we enjoy, included the welfare systems that we enjoy. And actually there is a role, I think, for philanthropy and social enterprise to be, again, the laboratory. If you think about our body, most of our DNA, about 70% of our DNA is viruses that infected us, and the body reabsorbed them. And I think that's the dynamic we should see between the state and social enterprise and philanthropy. Innovating, coming up with new solutions to complex problems which advocacy can sometimes address, but not always come up with solutions to. And in getting to a certain scale where it's impossible for the government to ignore it. I mean, you look at right now, food banks right now. It's scaling, it's providing a real service, but it's also engaging in advocacy, also starting to get government here to kind of think about how it has to rewire everything from, DWP, work, welfare, and so on. So I think there's a role for the state, but I wouldn't downplay the role, particularly in the future, for social entrepreneurs and philanthropists as well.
Afshan, what's your view on this advocacy question?
I think there's two things. One, I think there's too much of a tendency to say it's either social enterprise, it's either philanthropy, it's either aid, or it's either government. And more we're seeing that all four need to work together. The innovation is one piece. The potential of government to scale depends on what country you're in. If you're dealing in post-conflict countries, beyond central capital, if I look at Kabul, outside, when I went to the provinces, very little operating unless it was at the grassroots and community level. And there it's very clear, and I did describe how we engage with community and local government. I think the aid versus development debate, it's a dead one. Most people rely on government support for basic health care and education. They're not businesses for the bottom or the base of the pyramid. So if you're going to be able to serve the vast majority of your population and prevent communicable disease, there's a role for government there. So I do think we need to look at it as where are the complementarities between the two.
My sense, Paul and Toby, is that you largely agree with that, but do you want to add anything to that kind of eclectic view of the different drivers of change?
I want to just say two quick things on India. One is, I think India is this remarkable place where there's both too little and too much of the state at the same time. Too little, we're trying to buy land in India. You can't find a good land registry in Varanasi. If you go and try and find title, there's literally a piece of handwritten paper with a piece of sellotape down the middle. which is put out before people in order for them to be able to clarify who owns what. And that's a massive impediment on development, and it's very bad for the poor not to have good land registry. So it's too little state. And on the other hand, there's a thicket of incredibly Byzantine and unhelpful regulations which are not pro-poor and don't help development on the other hand. So I think it's not about a big state or a small state, but a smart state. And then on the question of advocacy, I completely agree advocacy is absolutely central. In Ahmedabad, where we work, SAVA, the group of women who we source from, consciously bring Muslim and Hindu women together. And twice in the last 5 years, in response to provocation from Hindu nationalists to go out and kill Muslims, SAVA has rallied women on the streets, 15,000 at a time, to say there'll be no killing today when Muslim and Hindu women have locked arms. And that's a case of bottoms-up advocacy in resisting this kind of terrible threat from nationalists from above. So I think that advocacy is crucial to try and create a climate for peace and development in India in particular.
Toby, please excuse me, but I'm just going to take another round of questions because before we finish. There's a gentleman there and there's a gentleman here.
David Altschuler. I'm co-founder of One-to-One Children's Fund and also an African charity called Pediatric AIDS Treatment for Africa, PATA. I very much just want to follow on from government scale-up, the role of government in scale-up, and also the role of advocacy, and ask the panel about how we can best, or ask everyone, how do you think we can best nurture and inspire universal values, the values that underpin this, the development of the social reformers that and teach the wonderful graduates that are going to teach first. So how can we instill more of those values in our populations?
Thank you. And yeah.
Well,
yep.
My name is Dawood Azami. I'm also a young global leader. I work for the BBC World Service and I also teach as a visiting lecturer. Lord Way said that society is like a human body. A poet who lived around 900 years ago called all human beings as one body. And he said if one limb is in pain, the rest of the body becomes restless. So you said that we need an interdisciplinary approach. So my question is, what is stopping us from having this approach, this kind of approach?
Interdisciplinary approach. And then one last question. I feel like an auctioneer here. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Zoya Pan. I'm also from Young Global Leaders Society, and I'm from Burma, actually. I work with a human rights organization called Burma Campaign UK, and I'm living here as a refugee. Some of you, I suppose, are from Young Global Leaders, and many of you probably will go to Burma for the World Economic Forum. I'm very interested in hearing the thoughts from the panels, because when I hear about women rights and all of you hear about advocacy and also tackling the root causes of the problem from Toby and giving and making donations. One of the questions I would like to ask is in terms of women, the discriminations against women, gender inequality, and the treatment of women in Asian countries. And I would like to ask your opinion on how you think about accountability and keeping the government accountable, because many of the countries, this kind of violence against women is largely based on state-sponsored policy, especially in Burma, where I come from. Government has a policy using rape as a weapon of war against ethnic minorities, and women face sexual violence, including rape and gang rape. Many women do not get support from charities or any of international community. So what is your opinion on accountability from the government? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, panel. So we have three questions for you to kind of maybe choose one of them in particular to focus on. A question about values, a question about a more kind of interdisciplinary, joined up kind of approach, and then a question which I guess, Ashan, is particularly directed to you in relation to the accountability of states that sponsor violence and oppression, violence towards women, oppression of women. So let's kind of go in reverse order. Toby.
Well, I'd find it easier to answer the previous set of questions, but I mean, in regard to the interdisciplinarity, that's a very difficult issue, and it would be great if we could get more ways to look across these things and to make these correct comparisons. I don't know of particularly good tools to do this at the moment. I mean, there's two aspects there. One is the stuff I'm more focused on is the impact analysis. If you're looking at things that help, say, empowering women versus things that help, say, preventing deaths, how are you supposed to compare them? It's very difficult. I think that there are some approaches you can do. I don't think that just tackling them each separately is the best approach. But I think it does need at least some value judgments to be made by the funder as to how to compare these things. And if they're explicit about this, then you can do better than if you're not explicit about it. You can find, in fact, that if you're not explicit, you can make demonstrably bad decisions. If you just at one point try to help one thing and one point help the other thing, you would have often been better by trying to help both, say. But the question about how to get the interdisciplinarity into the ideas and create new approaches that help both things is probably more something that Nat could answer.
Thank you, Toby. Paul?
Two quick ideas about values. The one is I'm really have become very persuaded by Varshini's idea of associational life as a way of generating values, because I think you create more enduring values in society by, rather than sending Israelis and Palestinians on canoeing trips together for 2 weeks and then everybody goes back home, as important as that may be, I think you have to find the ways of allowing people to coexist and cooperate as much as possible, because I think values get generated through lived experience rather than we're all going to be nice to each other for this 72 hours and then we're going to go back to very separate ways of being. So building communities is a really important way of thinking about values. And then on the women's question, I think one of the single most important ways that you build gender equality, respect for women, and reduce violence against women is by giving women equal opportunity and by economically empowering them. There's a ton of other stuff you have to do. It's complex, but I'm a great fan of trying to find ways of giving women the status that comes with both employment and resources. And I think that we just have demonstrable evidence that violence against women goes down, all other things being equal when that happens.
Thank you. And I think, Paul, you're right. The evidence shows that kind of artificially engineered contact simply doesn't work, despite the fact there are so many charities involved in making that happen, actually. Ashan?
I think I'll pick up on the point. In most situations, we see a reduction in violence against women when they are economically empowered and able to participate more at the community and household level in decision making. When you're talking about rape that's systematically committed against women, as it was in Bosnia, where Women for Women first started, or Syria now, or Burma, as you mentioned, I think there's three key things that are important. One is that rape is now considered a crime of war, and there's absolutely a need to prosecute for that. Secondly, at the national level, there has to be some form of condonement and sanction. Thirdly, I think women coming forward together in networks and alliances is very important. But equally, I think one of the things that we found worked well in Congo was actually training militia leaders on why rape was wrong, what the sanction was as rape as a war crime, and really ensuring that there was basically an understanding. And then fifthly is, I think, what you were alluding to, the whole element of providing networks of support for women who have been victims, or survivors, I should say, because they're survivors of sexual assault and violence, to really have some element of rebuilding their lives.
Thank you. Nat?
I think I'll pick up on the interdisciplinary question and how we get more people to have the right values. You know, I think the issue today in certainly the modern, the developed world, as well as the modern world, is one of risk. It's too risky to have the right values. It's too risky to step into this space. It's too risky to get out of your silo and connect with others in other silos. So if we've spent 200 years developing laws and legal frameworks, resources, and sort of finance, which is still work in progress, the challenge now is how do we create the institutions, the ventures, if you like, that adjust the risk equation for people so they can work across different silos and solve problems in an interdisciplinary way. And the challenge in all of this, I have to say, when it comes to measurement, is, and this is why I do want to pick up on why I'm a bit poo-poo about things like SROI, is I think that kind of measurement reinforces the silos and forces us to stay in our own worlds, or levels everything and says everything's the same. Looking after pets is the same as saving someone's life or preventing kind of rape. To me, ultimately you can use things like randomized controlled study, which is something I want to have further work in through my center to look at. But that takes years and years. In the very short term, in the very early stages of any initiative, to me, the only thing that counts is, do I believe that this person who says they're going to help X pets or prevent so many deaths will deliver what they say to me now they will deliver in a few years' time? And that's all about probability and risk as well. And venture capitalists do it all the time. And that's the kind of skills I think we need to build for the short-term innovation work, and not just rely on post-ante analysis of what happened, because otherwise some of these problems won't get solved.
Well, thank you all for some really great questions. I want to thank Intelligence Squared. I want to thank Deutsche Bank Asset and Wealth Management, who made this whole event possible. You can stay behind for another half an hour or so and have a drink and something to eat. And I think our speakers will be going around, staying here for a bit longer as well, if you want to network with them and ask them questions. I found it an absolutely fascinating session with 4 incredibly impressive people. So can I ask you to join me in thanking our panel?